Something about this situation doesn't sit right. Not because of what people saw, but because of what quietly followed after. When the altercation clip involving Rada surfaced online, it moved fast. Views climbed, reactions poured in, and then, the conversation stalled. There was no clear follow-up. No urgency to explain. No strong attempt to correct the narrative. Just distance. And silence. Then came the update no one expected. Nadia Nakai had been hospitalized. There was no detailed context shared alongside it. No clear timeline connecting events, and no statement clarifying whether anything was related at all. And that absence of clarity is what made people uneasy. Fans weren't reacting to drama, they were reacting to uncertainty. Because when two serious developments happen close together, and nothing is said, people don't calm down. They start noticing things. Old moments suddenly feel different. Neutral behavior feels guarded. Silence stops feeling normal and starts feeling deliberate. What unsettled audiences wasn't a claim or an accusation. It was the feeling that something important was being handled quietly, while the public was left watching from the outside. And the biggest question lingering online became this. If nothing was connected, why did the silence feel louder than any explanation ever could? To understand why recent events unsettled so many people, it's important to look at what the situation looked like before anything felt dramatic. Because stories like this don't begin with an incident, they begin with patterns that only seem meaningful in hindsight. For a long time, the public dynamic between Nadia Nakai and Rada appeared steady and unremarkable. They moved within overlapping industry circles, shared public spaces, and existed in close enough proximity for their interactions, or lack of them, to feel familiar to long-time followers. There was no obvious closeness, but there was also no friction. Just quiet coexistence. And that quiet balance mattered. When public figures maintain a consistent rhythm, audiences unconsciously form expectations. They notice when appearances feel routine, when acknowledgements feel natural, when presence, even minimal, remains predictable. This doesn't mean people are watching for drama. It means they recognize stability when it exists. For months, that stability held. There were no public disagreements, no heated exchanges, no visible distancing that clearly signaled a shift. If anything, things seemed neutral enough to fade into the background, which is often where the most important baselines are formed. What made later developments feel unsettling wasn't a sudden rupture, but the gradual erosion of that neutrality. Some observers began noticing absences rather than events. Fewer shared appearances in spaces where overlap had once felt normal. Less casual acknowledgement online. Moments where paths that previously crossed without comment now seemed to miss each other entirely. On their own, these changes meant nothing. Schedules evolve. People grow busier. Professional priorities shift. But patterns are rarely visible in isolation. These subtle changes seem to occur during a period when public attention around their wider circle appeared heightened. More interviews. More scrutiny. More moments where every word, pause, and expression felt amplified. Under those conditions, even small behavioral changes can feel significant, not because they confirm anything, but because they invite interpretation. Rada's public presence during this period became a quiet point of focus. Her appearances remained composed, but some viewers felt a shift in tone. Responses appeared more controlled. Interviews felt shorter. Energy felt contained. To some, this signaled maturity or professionalism. To others, it felt like restraint layered over pressure. Both interpretations could exist without one cancelling the other out. Nadia, on the other hand, maintained a consistent outward image, but appeared slightly more selective with visibility. Supporters framed this as boundary setting, a perfectly reasonable choice. Others noted the timing felt unusual when placed alongside broader contextual shifts. Again, no proof. Just perception. And perception is powerful, especially when no one is actively directing it. What's important here is that none of these observations suggested conflict. There were no confrontations captured, no statements hinting at tension, no moments anyone could confidently label as a breaking point. What people sensed wasn't a problem, it was a change in energy. Fans didn't believe something had gone wrong. They believed something had shifted. That difference matters. When audiences sense change without explanation, they don't immediately speculate about cause. They simply begin watching more closely. Neutral moments feel heavier. Silence feels louder. Ordinary distance feels intentional. By the time the altercation involving Rada entered public conversation, people weren't encountering it with fresh eyes. They were encountering it layered over months of quiet noticing, feelings without conclusions, patterns without proof. And because no one had drawn attention to these shifts before, the moment they were placed next to a public incident, they felt suddenly organized, as if separate pieces might belong to the same unfinished picture. Not because they necessarily did, but because stories rarely land on empty ground. By this point, nothing had been said. Nothing had been confirmed. Yet something had been noticed. And in the world of public narratives, noticing is often the first step toward doubt, not accusation, but curiosity. A curiosity that had been building quietly, waiting for a moment that would make it feel valid. Once the altercation involving Rada entered public awareness, the conversation shifted almost instantly, not because the details were clear, but because expectations changed. People anticipated the familiar rhythm that usually follows moments like this: context, clarification, a statement that either calms the story down or redirects it. Instead, that rhythm never arrived. And that absence became impossible to ignore. The days that followed were marked less by action and more by stillness. Interviews that took place afterward felt noticeably careful. Responses were brief. Pauses lingered slightly longer. Nothing explicitly referenced the situation, yet everything seemed to orbit around it. For viewers, this restraint felt deliberate, not in a conspiratorial sense, but in a controlled one. As if words were being chosen not just for what they said, but for what they avoided. Body language became a language of its own. Calm expressions were read as professionalism by some and emotional distance by others. A neutral tone sounded composed to supporters and guarded to critics. No single moment confirmed anything, but together, these fragments fueled interpretation. What gave these reactions weight wasn't what was visible, it was what was missing. There were no clear statements connecting or separating events. No direct acknowledgement of the growing online conversation. And in gossip culture, silence isn't neutral. It creates space. Space that audiences instinctively fill. Questions began appearing across comment sections and social platforms, often framed softly enough to avoid judgment. Is it just me, or does something feel off? Why hasn't this been addressed yet? Maybe we don't know the full story. These weren't accusations. They were emotional check-ins. People trying to confirm whether others felt the same unease. As the update about Nadia Nakai's hospitalization circulated, that unease intensified. The issue wasn't the hospitalization itself. Audiences understood that medical matters are deeply personal. What unsettled people was the proximity. Two serious developments appearing close together with no connective narrative offered. Importantly, no official source suggested the events were related. And no one credible claimed they were. But the absence of clarity allowed speculation to exist quietly, without structure. Rumors didn't arrive fully formed. They emerged through implication, phrased as possibility rather than assertion. How did this happen? Could stress have played a role? Is it all just coincidence? Because these questions had no confirmed answers, repetition gave them power. The more they were asked, the more they felt valid. This is where the story emotionally anchored itself. Not in outrage, but in discomfort. People didn't feel invited into understanding, they felt kept at a distance. And distance, when paired with emotional investment, deepens curiosity rather than dissolving it. Some voices tried to slow the narrative down, reminding others that silence can be protective. That public figures aren't obligated to narrate private moments. These perspectives were present, but they existed alongside growing speculation, not in place of it. By now, the tension wasn't rising dramatically, it was settling. Becoming heavier. Instead of peaking, the story flattened into something unresolved. A waiting room of unanswered questions. And that unresolved state is what made the narrative stick. The situation no longer felt like a moment, it felt like something ongoing. Audiences stopped watching for explanations and started watching for signs. A delayed appearance. A careful interview. A controlled response. None of these meant anything on their own, but together, they kept the story alive. Not because of what was said, but because so much wasn't. By the time the conversation settled into its quieter phase, the story was no longer being driven by events. It was being driven by interpretation. What people were reacting to wasn't new information, it was the sustained absence of it. Psychologically, silence is rarely neutral when expectations exist. When audiences feel emotionally invested and anticipate explanation, quietness creates imbalance. The mind instinctively tries to restore that balance by filling in gaps. Sometimes it fills them with reasonable possibilities. Other times, with suspicion or imagined intent. In public narratives, this process intensifies because thousands of people are filling the same gaps simultaneously. This is where silence begins to feel like meaning, even when no meaning is intended. Importantly, silence doesn't suggest wrongdoing on its own, but it does invite interpretation. And once interpretation begins, it becomes difficult to control. A major factor here is optics. Visual moments, facial expressions, posture, pauses, often feel more convincing than words, even though they reveal far less. A composed appearance can feel calculated. A calm response can feel emotionally distant. But optics are fragments, captured without the internal context of the person being observed. The camera records behavior, not motivation. Still, when those fragments arrive during periods of uncertainty, they're rarely seen in isolation. They're layered onto existing doubts. This is why facts struggled to ground this situation. There weren't enough of them. And without facts, perception naturally stepped in. Viewers weren't evaluating confirmed information, they were evaluating consistency, tone, and emotional cues. Yet there are plausible explanations that don't rely on hidden conflict at all. Privacy is one. Medical situations, in particular, don't require public narration. Choosing not to explain can be less about concealment and more about protection of personal space, mental health, or dignity. Protection, too, extends beyond individuals. In situations already distorted by clips and partial context, responding can unintentionally amplify misinformation. Silence can sometimes be a strategic decision, not to avoid accountability, but to avoid escalation. Then there's complexity. Real-life situations are rarely linear. Events can overlap without being connected. Stress can exist without a single cause. Public moments can coincide with private struggles without sharing origin. These realities don't translate cleanly into online narratives, which prefer clear timelines and resolved endings. But complexity doesn't satisfy emotionally driven curiosity. What audiences most struggled with wasn't a lack of answers, it was the feeling of exclusion. The sense of watching something important unfold from the outside without ever being invited into understanding it. That distance is uncomfortable. It encourages people to look closer, not step back. At a certain point, the question stopped being what happened, and became why does this feel unfinished? The absence of conclusion allowed the story to linger. No statement closed it. No update reframed it. And unresolved narratives tend to echo longer than resolved ones. They stay active in the mind, resurfacing whenever new fragments appear. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that the truth was never clearly defined, not because it's unreachable, but because it doesn't exist in a form easily shared. Some stories don't end with revelation. They end with awareness. Awareness of how silence can feel suspicious. Of how optics can overpower reality. And of how narratives are often shaped as much by what's missing as by what's shown. This story didn't collapse into certainty. It remained suspended. And sometimes, that suspension speaks louder than any explanation ever could. Before we end this conversation, it's important to pause and remember one thing. This story was never about rushing toward a verdict. It was about observing how narratives form when information is limited and emotions are high. Now, let's shift the focus to you. When situations like this unfold in public silence, what feels more responsible to you? Speaking quickly to correct the narrative, or staying quiet to avoid fueling speculation even further? Do you see silence as protection, or does it unintentionally create more questions than it answers? And where do we, as the audience, fit into this? When clips, headlines, and fragments circulate without context, how much of the story do we end up writing ourselves? Are we responding to reality, or to the discomfort of not knowing? These aren't questions with single, correct answers. And that's why your perspective matters. If you notice something others may have missed, or if you completely disagree with how this situation has been interpreted online, share your thoughts in the comments. Respectful discussion adds layers that one voice alone never could. If you appreciate gossip storytelling that slows the moment down instead of inflaming it, take a second to like this video so it reaches others who value thoughtful conversation. Subscribe to the channel for long-form breakdowns that focus on nuance rather than conclusions, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories that evolve quietly instead of exploding loudly. Because not every story ends with a statement. Not every truth arrives clearly. And sometimes, the most important part of a public narrative isn't what finally gets explained. It's what remains unanswered, long after the noise fades.